Hello, and welcome to week 10 of Ethics and Society Online. This week, we're going to be reading Rousseau's Discourse upon the Origins and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. So you'll see the link in your syllabus to the Project Gutenberg site for the week 10 reading, so be sure to read that prior to starting these slides. So here's a bit of background on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is an 18th century political philosopher. He was a prolific writer who was born in Geneva, Switzerland. He wrote literature, philosophy, social theory. One of his works, Emile, is still studied in education today. So a really profound and influential thinker who lived most of his life between Switzerland and France and died in 1778 just outside of Paris. The discourse on the origins of and foundations of inequality among men is a discourse that focuses in on that state of nature, which is that state we talked about, the pre-political state of humanity that's used in social contract theories. So similar to Hobbes, we're getting a depiction of human nature by painting how we existed prior to entering into the state. Okay, and with the particular goal here with Rousseau to find how did inequality occur? So you could see this first quote here. What therefore is precisely the subject of this discourse, it is to point out in the progress of things that moment when, right taking place of violence, nature became subject to law, to display that chain of surprising events in consequence of which the strong submitted to serve the weak, and the people to purchase imaginary ease at the expense of real happiness. So we're getting a little bit of a sense that Rousseau wanted us to study the origins of human nature in order to see how inequality arose, and also a little bit of his belief that that inequality is wrong here towards the end of that quote. So Rousseau was a philosopher who was very well read, and he had read many of the contemporaries that came before him, especially Thomas Hobbes, and he was aware of Hobbes's claims that the state of nature was a naturally competitive, violent, and even warful state where we egoistically seek our own self-preservation at the expense of others. Yet Rousseau depicts a different vision of human nature and thinks that we're quite distinct from the humanity that's portrayed by Thomas Hobbes. He says the philosophers who have examined the foundations of society have, every one of them, perceived the necessity of tracing it back to the state of nature, but not one of them has ever arrived there. So you could get the sense that he's not satisfied with the depiction of human nature that his forebears have had, and he wants to show us what he thinks on his own. So Rousseau paints a picture of his concept of human nature, and I've used the image here of Edmund Hicks' Peaceable Kingdom, which you'll see kind of depicts humanity in an infancy with the animals all peaceably living together. And he conceives of the human being as one that's sufficiently able to take care of oneself, also one that lives peacefully in the state of nature. So he imagines that we have our needs met by living in this state of nature, although we do not advance beyond a kind of primitive or childish state. So this image is pretty good at depicting what life might be like if we were in the state of nature. He says, and I'm quoting now from the reading, if I strip this being thus constituted of all supernatural gifts which he may have received, and of all the artificial faculties which he could not have acquired but by slow degrees, if I consider him in a word such as he must have issued from the hands of nature, I see an animal less strong than some, less active than others, but, upon the whole, the most advantageously organized of any. I see him satisfying calls of hunger under the first oak, and those of thirst at the first rivulet, so there's a river. I see him laying himself down to sleep at the foot of the same tree that afforded his meal, and behold, this done, all his wants are completely supplied. So we find ourselves quite satisfied and living contentedly with the fruits of nature prior to living in society. So, what we have here is a viewpoint of the state of nature in stark contrast to Hobbes. He does not view this as a state of competition or war. Instead, he views humanity as living in a kind of primitive simplicity, self sufficient, relatively self reliant. When we do have the potential to cooperate or to exist alongside other beings, we do so rather peacefully. Here's just a quote from Rousseau's Discourse. Hobbes would have it that man is naturally void of fear and always intent upon attacking and fighting. This indeed may be very true in regard to objects with which he is not acquainted, and I make no doubt of his being terrified at every new sight that presents itself, as often as he cannot distinguish the physical good and evil which he may expect. But savage man, living among other animals without any society or fixed habitation, and finding himself early under the necessity of measuring his strength with theirs, soon makes a comparison between both, and finding that he surpasses them more in address than they surpass him in strength, he learns not to be any longer in dread of them. So we find that humanity does not feel threatened by its existence in this state of nature. Rather, we use our superior human skills to kind of live peacefully in that natural state. So similar to that depiction by Edmund Hicks, the result is that the state of nature is a relatively peaceable kingdom. There are not the complexities or the advances of our civil society, but human beings live relatively well suited to survive within the existing environment. Here's a quote from the reading. To this, we may add that no animal naturally makes war upon man, except in the case of self-defense or extreme hunger, nor ever expresses against him any of these violent antipathies, which seem to indicate that some particular species are intended by nature for the food of others. He's basically also saying that in the state of nature, we do not have animals really naturally kind of competing with one another for survival. And important for a course in the study of ethics is that Rousseau is saying that we're not naturally prone to violence and this tendency to competition that ends in war. So, according to Rousseau's uh, discourse here, we're not naturally vice-ridden. It's a complicated matter because Hobbes said that right and wrong do not exist in the state of nature, but Rousseau says, well, similar to Hobbes, that the state of nature is a place in which morality truly does not exist or is not defined as it is in civil society. However, we're not living in this kind of chaotic, violent, constantly fearful, almost amoral state that Hobbes depicted in the state of nature. So here's a quote from the reading. But above all things, let us beware, concluding with Hobbes, that man, as having no idea of goodness, must be naturally bad, that he is vicious because he does not know what virtue is, that he always refuses to do any service to those of his own species because he believes that none is due to them, that in virtue of what that right which he justly claims to everything he wants, he foolishly looks upon himself as proprietor of the whole universe. So we don't get this kind of delusion of grandeur, overly self-obsessed vision of human nature that we have in the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. Notably in Rousseau, we have a second instinct that combines with our instinct for self-preservation, and that is an instinct for pity. So Rousseau argues that our self-preservation instinct is balanced with this instinct for pity, and what this does is it helps us solidify our social nature, and it avoids the needless harm to others, as is depicted in a narrative like that of Hobbes. So here's a quote from your reading for today. Here is besides another principle that has escaped Hobbes, and which having been given to man to moderate the desire of self-preservation. I mean that of pity, a disposition suitable to creatures weak as we are and liable to so many evils, a virtue so much the more useful, and withal useful to man, as it takes place in him of all manner of reflection, and so natural that the beasts themselves sometimes give evident signs of it, talking about animals there, not to speak of the tenderness of mothers for their young, and of the dangers they face to screen them from danger. With what reluctance are horses known to trample upon living bodies? One animal never passes unmoved by the dead carcass of another animal of the same species. So he says this instinct for pity exists not only in the human animal, but in other animals that are related to us, and it is a natural instinct that combines with our self-preservative one. And because of this instinct that we have for pity, we balance this self preservative instinct with the pity, so we have a kind of bounded will. It is therefore certain that pity is a natural sentiment which, by moderating in every individual the activity of self love, contributes to the mutual preservation of the whole species. It is this pity which hurries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see in distress. It is this pity which, in a state of nature, stands for laws, for manners, for virtue, with this advantage that no one is tempted to disobey her sweet and gentle voice. So he sees pity, Rousseau sees pity here as an instinct that actually combines for mutual with our self-preservative instinct for a mutual preservation, and helps solidify some of the primitive bonds that we'd have in society. Now, no doubt this is a peaceful state in the state of nature before we enter into society, but this is also a kind of idle state or a state without progress. And Rousseau therefore sees, no harm to humanity in the state of nature, but rather just a society that's kind of always in a constant state of childhood, not really getting any of those social advantages that we see in a more modern civil society. He says, quote, "Let us conclude that savage man, wandering about in the forests, without industry, without speech, without any fixed residence, an equal stranger to war and every social connection, without standing in any shape in need of his fellows, as well as without any desire of hurting them, let us, I say, conclude that savage man thus circumstanced had no knowledge or sentiment, but such as are proper to that condition. If he happened to make any discovery, he could the less communicate it, as he did not even know his own children. The art perished with its inventor. There was neither education nor improvement. Generations succeeded generations to no purpose. And as all constantly set out from the same point, whole centuries rolled on. In the rudeness and barbarity of the first age, the species was grown old, while the individual still remained in a state of childhood. So we get a sense that this really is not a desirable place for social progress. So just as in Thomas Hobbes, we'll see in Rousseau that he advocates for a social contract, and real progress will only come when we collaboratively enter this social contract and start creating a system of progress that solidifies our mutual interest through the laws. So remember, in a social contract, we form an agreement to surrender some or all of our individual private rights to enter the protection of a stable government. The government and its laws will be instituted voluntarily by the public. So Rousseau does see this as a need. He does definitely know that we need to enter into society. I shall not now enter upon the inquiries which still remain to be made into the nature of the fundamental pacts of every kind of government, but following the common opinion, confine myself in this place to the establishment of the political body as a real contract between the multitude and the chiefs elected by it, a contract by which both parties oblige themselves to the observance of the laws that are therein stipulated and form the bands of their union. So we similar to the narrative in Hobbes, we get a sense of a mutual contract conferring people in places of authority. But in his later writings on the social contract, we see that the social contract in Rousseau is quite different. So, in Rousseau's later writings on the social contract, he claims that the social contract should not just be something that exists for our protection. So, in other words, we should not just implement an arbitrary, random authority with absolute power to punish the laws on our behalf and protect our self preservation, but rather there's a kind of an overarching obligation for that society to benefit what Rousseau called the general will. Okay. And when we think think of the general will, I think we might think of like the common good or something like that notion, where society has some obligation in its laws and practices to provide this to the population. Okay, so again, big difference from Hobbes. We're not merely protecting individuals from another with this social contract, but we also are seeking some kind of mutual social benefits or a system of social programs that would be mutually beneficial to all of the population. These benefits, the social goods, he calls the general will. They'll provide objective goods, in his view, to all members of society. It's the job of the leaders in government also to just adhere to that general will. So in his philosophy, Rousseau's philosophy, as opposed to Hobbes, the people who are elected, the chiefs, as it were, that he was talking about, or people in political power, they don't have special authority. Rather, they're just enacting the force of that general will. And what's really interesting about Rousseau's concept of the government under the general will is that he thought we weren't really going to be less free as a result of this social contract. He thought we would not surrender liberty to the government. Rather, we would remain as free as before, because whatever we are giving up to the government in terms of, let's say, our self-preservative abilities, or if it's some kind of social good, if we're giving it up for some kind of mutual benefit, we will actually reach a more potent freedom, a more stronger social good by kind of collaborating and implementing in group force some of our social programs. So you could imagine things like, public funded education, the post office, a system of public libraries, our public transportation systems, or our public roads, utility systems, like all of these things that we call common goods, that we contribute to in some way or another through our private taxation or private efforts, right? These are the things that Rousseau thought would make us as free as before, and in fact better suited to live well in society. So just a wrap-up slide for this week, a very important slide, because in week 11, in week 11 we meet on November 18th, but in week 10 we are not meeting because of Veterans Day. Well, first I should say, please thank a veteran. Next Wednesday, make sure that you thank your friend who's a veteran, or if you know someone who's active duty military, or if you are yourself, thank you for your service and what you do for the country. This is certainly something that we talk a lot about in ethics and society, the need for that kind of effort. So our next meeting will be November 18th, which is next Wednesday at 8 a.m. The week 10 discussion topic has been posted, so it's up there now. You'll see a topic through the week 10 folder or the discussion board link. It is comparing viewpoints between Hobbes and Rousseau, seeing who you agree with more. So make sure you post your original response by Friday and a response to one classmate by Sunday. And then this is very important. In week 10, there is a quiz. So this week there is a quiz. It is based on the Hobbes and Rousseau readings. So be sure to read both of those texts and review the slides. Just like our usual weekly quizzes, it will be open Thursday, November 12th in the morning through Friday, November 13th. So please, 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 even though we do not meet this week, please do not forget to complete the quiz. Okay, wishing you all a good week, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks.